Hello learners, you are watching video on Hermione Squad, a group of literary students initiative. If you are new to this channel, please do like, share and subscribe. Today's session is on Neoclassical period. So let's start the session. Neoclassical period. The Neoclassical period is a long and fruitful epoch in the history of British literature and culture. It was the first half of the Age of Revolution in England. It is a period where counterfeiting and facades are very important. In some ways, the country was trying to act like the interim and English civil wars had not happened, and there is both a willful suppression of the immediate past and a glorification of the more distant classical Roman past, which is why it is called the Neoclassical period. The term Neoclassical was derived from the combination of the terms neo, which means new, and classical, as in the day of the Roman and Greek classics. And the writers of this period looked back to the ideals and art forms of classical times, emphasizing even more than their Renaissance predecessors the classical ideals of order and rational control. But while they imitated the ancient Greek and Roman literary tradition, they lacked the originality of the writers of that period. Hence, this period is called as pseudo-classical age to mean the artificiality of the writers of this age. This was also regarded as the era of enlightenment, which emphasized logic and reason. Period of Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism, the artistic style, was the predominant movement in European art, architecture, and literature during the late 17th and 18th century. It reflected a desire to rekindle many styles, and the spirit of classical antiquity inspired directly from the classical period, which coincided and reflected the developments in philosophy and other areas of the Age of Enlightenment. This was a time of comfortableness in England. People were very interested in appearances, but not necessarily in being genuine. Men and women commonly wore wigs on head, and being clever and witty was in vogue. Having good manners and doing the right thing, particularly in public, was essential. And people would meet at coffee houses to chat about politics, among other topics, and sometimes drink a new warm beverage, which marked the beginning of British tradition of drinking afternoon tea. And the institution of coffee houses later developed cliques and parties, taught people the art of conversation, and gave birth to the typically British institution of a club. The Neoclassical period was a time too of British political upheaval, as 8 monarchs took the throne. Neoclassicism dominated English literature from the Restoration in 1660 until the end of the 18th century, when the publication of lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge marked the full emergence of Romanticism. characteristics of the period. As Neoclassicism is a long and profuse period in the history of British literature and culture, its most characteristic features began to mold intellectual trends and artistic phenomena in the Restoration, more influentially at the end of the period, to dominate fully the culture of the country in the 18th century. To a certain extent, Neoclassicism represented a reaction against the optimistic, exuberant, and enthusiastic Renaissance attitudes. They replaced the Renaissance emphasis on imagination, on invention and experimentation, and on mysticism with an emphasis on order and reason, on restraint, on common sense, and on religious, political, economic, and philosophical conservation. When we compare Neoclassicism to Renaissance, we see that it is far more standardized and conventional. It is a colder and more restrained period, the epoch of fixing of habits marked by the strict following of the worked out rules of behavior and writing, preoccupied mainly with manners and accepted standards, which were defined predominantly by detachment and moderation. The Neoclassical period was a time when conservatism flourished in both politics and literature. The period, also marked by the rise of a new trend, deism, the intellectual backlash against earlier Puritanism, and it manifested the shift towards the worldly in the religious sphere, also bearing the stamp of rational skepticism. Generally distrustful of emotions, people started to abhor the quality of enthusiasm in religion and began to suspect the fanatic Puritan attitudes. Many had troubles even with the belief in the divine nature of Christ and in providence. Another trend in this period was rationalism. People of those years were chiefly interested in human beings and in the observation of human activities. They thought that man's greatness lies primarily in him being a rational entity. Rationalism, the belief in reason and experiment, led to the observation of life as it was, to the contemplation of things themselves. And Neoclassicism was also categorized by intellectual curiosity concerning details of the surrounding world. The drive towards the acquisition and spread of knowledge was so powerful that the epoch is often called the Enlightenment. Neoclassical literature. Neoclassical literature has been written in a period where social order was undergoing a tremendous change, and its literature reflected many of the characteristics of the period. The Neoclassical literature is categorized by order, accuracy, and structure, and it brought a sense of decorum and stability to writers. There were rules to be carefully followed too. And also, there is unity in the works of all writers. Neoclassical literature lacks the complexity of that of many other periods. But this perhaps enables the critic to show that no literary expression is really simple, at the same time that its comparative simplicity makes easier the application of a literary method to the discovery of neglected values. Also, in this period, sophistication in thought and style is emphasized. The literature of this age is mainly concerned with human nature. The general thirst for knowledge immediately influenced literature. Its aesthetic function rapidly diminished, and literature was considered primarily as a means of education, becoming mostly didactic and moral. Types of literature. Some popular types of neoclassical literature included parody, essays, satire, letters, fables, melodrama, and rhyming with couplets. Among these forms of literature, the most famous were the essays, both in verse and prose. While drama declined and almost disappeared during the latter part of the period, novel made its entry. The literature of the age was mostly comic and satiric. An important failure of the age was to produce tragedy. However, some of England's most brilliant literature can be credited to this era. Literary features. Influence of materialism. After the Renaissance, Platonism and Christian humanism, we find in the neoclassical age the dominance of materialism and empirical science. The philosophical empiricism of the age, propagated through the writings of Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke, were supported and strengthened by the advancement of empirical science. Under the influence of empirical philosophy and experimental science, writers of the age narrowed both their vision of man and view of life. The affairs of men, their politics, their morals and manners became the chief concern. Imitation of classics. One of the most important features of the neoclassical literature is the imitation of the classics of ancient Greek and Roman literature. Authors exhibited a strong traditionalism. Although the Renaissance writers had imitated the classics, whereas Renaissance writers derived inspirations from the classics rather than copying the models of the past. The neoclassical writers strictly adhered to the authority of their models. Thus, neoclassical literature can be called as traditional. The neoclassical writers like Dryden, Pope, Swift, and Johnson were convinced that the excellence and perfection in the literary art have been attained by the Roman writers of antiquity. Thus, they can only copy the models of perfection and excellence. Concept of nature. The concept of nature was also an important characteristic of the neoclassical age. By nature, they meant the general human nature. The general human nature was not what the ordinary men and women felt and thought, but the standard view of human nature as held by Homer and Horace. Like their static view of the world, the neoclassical writers thought of human nature also was something static and standard, which is the same in all men and remains the same at all times. And in this period, general rather than the individual qualities of human beings are given more importance. Concept of man. The neoclassical literature considers man as a limited being having limited power. A large number of satires and works of the period attack the man for his pride and advise him to remain content with his limited power of knowledge. They viewed human beings as limited agents who ought to set themselves only accessible goals. And in direct opposition to Renaissance view of man as a being fundamentally good and possessed of an infinite potential for spiritual and intellectual growth. Neoclassical theorists saw man as an imperfect being, and the writers portrayed man as inherently flawed, whose potential was limited. Neoclassic humanism. In this period, human beings, and especially human beings of an integral part of a social organization, were regarded as the primary subject matter of the major forms of literature. Poetry was held to be an imitation of human life, in a common phrase, a mirror held up to nature. And by the human actions it imitates and the artistic form it gives to the imitation, poetry is designed to yield both instruction and pleasure to the people who read it. In both the subject matter and the appeal of art, emphasis was placed on what human beings possess in common, representative characteristics, and widely shared experiences, thoughts, feelings, and tastes. That is, the primary aim of poetry is to give new and consummate expression to the great commonplaces of human wisdom, whose universal acceptance and durability are the best warrant of their importance and truth. Not art for art's sake, but art for humanity's sake, was the central idea of neoclassic humanism. Literature was conceived to be primarily an art, that is, a set of skills which, although it requires innate talents, must be perfected by long study and practice, and consist mainly in the deliberate adaptation of known and tested means to the achievement of foreseen ends upon the audience of readers. The neoclassic ideal, founded especially on Horace's Ars Poetica, is the craftsman's ideal, demanding finish, correction, and attention to detail. The new restraint. Writers in this period started inventing new words and regularizing vocabulary and grammar. Complex bodily metaphysical language, such as Shakespeare used in his major tragedies, was clarified and simplified. Age of Reason. Neoclassical period is often called the Age of Reason. Thinkers of this age considered reason to be the highest mental faculty and sufficient guide in all areas. Both religious beliefs and morality were grounded on reason. In literature also, the reason is predominant in the neoclassical age. Emotions and imaginations are also present, but in a controlled way. Subdivisions of neoclassical period. For the sake of convenience, the neoclassical period can be divided into three relatively coherent parts, which we will be discussing in our further videos. The Restoration period. This period takes its name from the restoration of the Stuart line to the England throne in 1660 at the end of the Commonwealth. And this period is also called the Age of Dryden, as he was the representative literary figure of the period. The Augustan Age. This age is called Augustan Age because the writers of this period imitated the style and elegance of the writers who wrote in Italy during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. And this span of time is also called the Age of Pope because Alexander Pope was the best known poet of the time. Age of Sensibility. This age is called the Age of Sensibility because reason, sensible views, and original genius controlled the literature of the time. An alternate name for this period, the Age of Johnson, stresses the dominant position of Dr. Samuel Johnson. This is all about neoclassical period. Hope you have got an idea about the period. We will be back with our next video on Restoration period, which comes under Neoclassical age. Thank you all and stay tuned.